Hey all, welcome back to my kitchen. Today I am showing you a recipe that I'm really excited about, but also my husband is very excited about. It was one of his favorite desserts growing up. It's Pennsylvania Dutch funny cake, sometimes referred to as funny cake pie. You're gonna see why in a second. So let's get started. This recipe has three components. There's a pie crust, a cake batter, and a chocolate sauce. I'll explain the assembly in a little bit, but the first thing I'm going to want to do is roll out my pie crust into a pie pan and just set it aside to chill while I assemble the rest of my stuff. To be perfectly honest, I am not sure how this pie crust is going to turn out. I made it a few months back around Christmas time and it's been sitting in my freezer. I thawed it out overnight in the refrigerator, so it is nice and chilled, but I don't think I have ever used a pre-made pie crust that has been sitting around that long. I know what you're thinking. You're like, you started off this video saying we were making funny cake. Why are you rolling out a pie crust? This dessert is kind of like a baked turducken. It is a cake baked in a pie crust. And I think that's why it gets the name funny cake, because it's kind of a funny dessert. Gonna make sure this is nice and snug in this pie pan. Get all the edges in there. I'm gonna wrap this really well because pie crust dries out in the refrigerator so fast. I guess this is as good a time as any to explain exactly how this whole thing is going to work. So we have our pie crust chilling, and the way this is going to bake is the cake batter is going to go into the pie shell, and then we're going to be pouring a chocolate syrup over top of that. As the cake bakes, the chocolate sauce is going to drip through the cake batter, and you're going to wind up with a marbled chocolate cake with kind of a gooey pool of chocolate between the cake layer and the pie shell. So what I'm going to make now is the chocolate sauce that's going to go on top of the cake batter. This one's really simple. We're going to mix a half a cup of sugar, a third of a cup of cocoa powder, a third of a cup of coffee. You aren't really going to taste the coffee in this, but coffee just makes chocolate taste better. If you don't like coffee or you have issues with caffeine, you could just use hot water instead. And then a quarter of a teaspoon of vanilla. We're going to mix that in a saucepan, and we're going to simmer it on the stove. We don't need to really bring this to a boil. We're just going to simmer it until the sugar melts. And then we're going to set all of that aside. Last stage, the cake. What I'm going to do for that is I'm going to mix a half a cup of sugar and 6 tablespoons of soft butter and whip those until they're light and pale and the sugar is beginning to dissolve. After that, I'm going to beat in 1 egg, 3/4 of a teaspoon of vanilla, 3/4 of a teaspoon of baking powder, half a teaspoon of baking soda, 1 cup of cake flour. You could use all-purpose flour here, but you're just going to get a denser cake, and then a half cup of buttermilk. And now we're at the stage where things start to get funny. What I have for this stage is my finished pie crust, my cake batter, my chocolate sauce, and then I've made an egg wash, which is just 1 egg beaten with a tablespoon of water. And we're going to take our cake batter and pour it right into our pie shell. I'm going to spread that evenly. I'm going to trim all of this excess pie crust. I'm going to do a fluted edge, but I don't need quite this much overhang. I'm cutting it pretty close to the lip of the pie pan. You could just crimp this with a fork, go around the outside, but I really like the look of a fluted pie shell. So all I'm going to do is take what little bit of overhang is left and kind of tuck it under until you can just see the lip of the pie dish. And then you take 2 fingers of your non-dominant hand and then the pointer finger of your dominant hand and just keep going around the edge, pushing up with 2 fingers and pushing back with the other until you have gone around the whole pie. La 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 la, it's all around the pie, la 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 la, and everybody's crimping la. Okay, this looks really skimpy. It looks like there's not enough to fill this pie shell, but don't forget this is cake batter. It will rise and we're gonna get a nice puffy dome. So the last thing, I'm gonna give my chocolate sauce one more whisk and pour this gently over the top. I don't want this to splash all over the place. I just want good coverage. Oh my gosh, this is so funny. It's hilarious. This looks like a disaster. There is something kind of magical about how all of this chocolate disappears and it finds its way to the bottom of the cake. I'm gonna quickly hit the edge of this liberally with the egg wash. That's just, my oven's ready. This is just to give it good browning. Oh, I got some chocolate sauce on the crust, no biggie. Since this is cake, you're gonna bake it at a lower temperature than you would most pies. Like pies, you usually bake at a pretty high temp. This is just gonna bake at 375. So this would not brown very well on its own. You wanna do the egg wash so that you get some color on here. Okay, funny cake goes into the oven 25 to 30 minutes until it passes the toothpick test. And I'll show you what this looks, it's gonna look completely different when it's done. I'll show you what it looks like when it's ready. "30 minutes in the oven at 375. My pie is done. As you can see, the chocolate sauce that we put on top has mostly absorbed in. There's still some chocolate on top, but you can see the cake starting to peek through. But one thing I forgot to mention, if you really want very distinct layers like pie crust, chocolate sauce, cake, you can, instead of putting the chocolate sauce on top, you can put the chocolate sauce right on the bottom of your pie shell and then gently dollop the cake batter on top. I like it when the chocolate sauce kind of cooks into the cake because then you get chocolate marbled throughout the cake. So it depends on how nice and neat you want your cake to look when you cut. But let's cut into this and I'll show you what the inside looks like. I always have such a hard time cutting even pieces. I never get the center of the pie right. Ooh, that pie crust is nice and crispy. And through what can only be described as magic, the chocolate made its way from the top of the pie down to the bottom layer. One might say it's kind of funny. I hope you give this recipe a try. I'm going to be back next week with another great baking recipe for you. Until then, see you around.